Hello, lovely viewers. You are most welcome to our channel Poetry Online. In this video, we shall be presenting to you the summary, analysis, major themes, setting, and characters of the play The Blinkards by Kobna Sechi. Kindly subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to get updates on all our new videos. Once again, let us assure you of a very interesting discussion. Get ready for this lesson. Kobna Sechi, known also as William Isuwaju Sechi, was born on 1st November 1892 in Cape Coast. Kobna Sechi attended Infantsipim Boys' School and later went to study English literature at the University of London. He was a disciple of Kingsley Hayford. He did not agree to the total rejection of the African religious belief in favor of Christianity. He practically and intellectually rejected this assertion through his philosophical writings and his plays, poems, and articles. The Blinkards and the Anglo-Fancy were both plays written to satirize overdependence on European standards as a way of life by Western-oriented fancies. His popular poems, The Sojourner and The Anglo-Fancy, were published in West Africa in 1918. Later in 1934, some of his poems appeared in Nancy Conrad's anthology, Negro. Kobna Sechi played a very active role in the politics of Gold Coast before his death. He was a member and later the last but one president of the Aborigines Right Protection Society, which agitated for the security of the rights of the local people. He continued actively in the struggle for independence, working side by side by Dr. J.B. Dankwa and Dr. Kwame Nkrumah until he died in 1956. The Blinkards was written by Kobna Sechi in 1915 as a drama to satirize the rejection of the African culture and beliefs and the overdependence on European values by Western-oriented fancies of the Gold Coast. In The Blinkards, Kobna Sechi speaks against all who look down upon the African culture as inferior, but esteem that of Europeans as superior. The play begins with Mrs. Brofisem having just returned from England. The fact that she has been to England puts her in the forefront as a model for fashion, behavior, ethics, and conduct. She pressurizes her husband to adopt the Western ways of life. She bans him from singing fancy songs, which according to her is only sung by Bushmen. She flatters Mr. Brofisem with names such as Jim and Darling, while she expects him to address her as Ducky, just as it is done by Mr. Gash, who lives in Seabourn in the East Coast. The being-to attitude of Mrs. Brofisem appears very attractive to Mr. Seba, a cocoa magnate and others in Cape Coast. He therefore sends his daughter to Mrs. Brofisem for her to be taught the English way of life, to make her more refined and more English. He named his daughter, who is called Araba Mansa, Barbara Eremintrude, a Latin name which neither Araba Mansa, Mr. Seba, nor Mrs. Brofisem could pronounce properly. He did this because of the fear of being rejected by Mrs. Brofisem. This definitely would have been the case if he had presented his daughter to Mrs. Brofisem as Araba Mansa. In Act 1, Scene 2, we find Mr. Okadu, a young man who wants to marry Miss Seba. He is very sure of being rejected if he does not learn to speak English and copy English mannerisms. He therefore went to be trained by Mr. Oyimze, a British-trained lawyer and a typical African who loves nothing but his African culture. During a garden party at Victoria Park in Cape Coast, Mrs. Brofisem's solely British adornment greatly attracts the ladies and other Cape Coasters. Her dress code is sharply contrasted by that of Mr. Oyimze, who was in a native dress. As Mr. Oyimze talks to Mrs. Brofisem at the party, Mr. Okadu takes the opportunity to talk to Miss Seba after they have collided against each other, with a male picking the lady's handkerchief for her falls down behind Miss Seba's chair. Mr. Okadu then expresses his joy in falling down because it had introduced them. They decided to take a walk around Victoria Park together, and they surrounded her to hear her speak. The remaining girls also come to Mr. Oyimze because he had also been to England. He tells them of the type of correct behaviors of Europe, which are acceptable to be adopted by the African girls. They love the European fashion. Later, when Mr. Okadu tells Mr. Oyinze about how they warn against any untraditional marriage procedure, he then advised him to use an affair between Mr. Okadu and Ms. Siba. Mr. Brofesen went ahead to make a wedding nonsensical, but he sheepishly accepts the arrangement, all because Mrs. Brofesen tells him it is done in England. This arrangement angers Nnasumpa to a ton of the Western-oriented fantas, blinds them from seeing any good in their professional own people in Cape Coast because they do not believe that an African can do any good in medicine. A very quick wedding arrangement is made by Mr. Okadu and Miss. In the end, characters such as Mr. Siba, Mr. and Mrs. Brofesen come to the realization that the native culture, law and practices are far better and more comfortable than that of the Europeans. Background to the play. The Blinkard was written in the colonial era in 1950 by esteem. Through education, some fantas and other dwellers of the coast had the privilege of traveling to Britain. On their arrival in Britain, some of the Gold Coasters failed to prove themselves faithful. They encountered their culture as inferior and esteemed the European one as superior. In the course of their stay in Europe, the Africans adopted anything that they were introduced to. Therefore, at their return to the Gold Coast, they despised their cultural values and heritage. They counted themselves as Western-oriented Gold Coasters. Those who did not travel with them saw their European fashion and mannerisms as a noble virtue worthy of emulation. They held these Western-oriented Gold Coasters as a model of a civilized life and living. The blind imitation of people who had imitated European culture and interpreted them wrongly affected various aspects of the life in the Gold Coast. Areas that suffered the stage of this new idealism were the native dress code, traditional marriage procedure, the speaking of local language, and the eating of local foods. Let's now consider the major themes of the play. The theme of colonialism. One of the major themes presented by Kobna Seche in the Blinkards is the theme of colonialism. Colonialism refers to the situation where one country rules over the other. The coming of the Europeans to Gold Coast affected the lives of the native people. The establishment of the European government over the indigenous people imposed European cultures on them. Through the building of schools and churches, the colonial masters indoctrinated the local people with their way of life. These activities led many Gold Coasters to disregard and look down upon their own cultural values. Mrs. Brofesen and members of the Cosmopolitan Club decided not to greet people in native clothing. Also, Mr. Oyinfe Parson vowed never to have anything to do with Nana Katawurwa and other Gold Coasters whom he regarded as heathens. In effect, colonialism brought about division among the indigenous people. The clash between tradition and modernity. In the Blinkards, there appears to be a sharp conflict between the African traditional values and the modern European values. According to the traditional norms and values, the husband is the head of the family. His decisions are recognized as the ultimate and superior over that of the woman. That is not so in European values, where the woman may have a great deal of dominance in the home. This is exemplified in the Brofesen family, where Mrs. Brofesen dominates the affairs of the family. She decides the kind of food that should be eaten, the kind of clothing that Mr. Brofesen should wear, etc. In contrast to Mr. Brofesen's family, Mr. Siba, a typical African man, takes full charge of his family. He decides to dictate what should be eaten, gives his daughter out to Mrs. Brofesen to train her, and later into marriage without the consent of his wife and mother-in-law. Again, we see a conflict between the African marriage and the European marriage. The wedding of Mr. Okadu and Ms. Siba was annulled because it was found to conflict with the traditional marriage procedure. The theme of marriage. The theme of marriage takes a greater part of the plot's action. The marriage between Ms. Siba and Mr. Okadu brings out other central ideas in the play. The eventual rejection of the marriage forms the climax of the play. In the traditional setup, marriage is a union between a man and a woman who have the consent of their families to live together. Without the approval of the families of the couple, no marriage was recognized as legitimate. The marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Brofesen, Mr. Okadu and Nnasumpa were legally accepted because they had the consent of the families of both sides. This is quite different from what takes place in the European marriage. In Europe, The male and female do not necessarily need to have the consent of their parents before marriage. This is what Mrs. Brofesen wanted to propagate in the Blinkards, but it unfortunately failed because it was contrary to the traditional marriage procedure of the indigenous people. Blind imitation of foreign culture. In the Blinkards, most of the characters copy directly or indirectly from the European culture. They do not consider whether or not it is suitable for them, their culture, and their environment. Mrs. Brofesen, who the playwright describes as a leader of fashion, is as well a leader of blind imitation of European culture. In the play, she just asks her husband to address her as Daki. She puts leaves in the book to dry and cigarette ashes on the carpet without finding out the main reason why these are done in England. All she says is that they must be done in Gold Coast because they are done in England. She deceived the Cape Coast girls into following this kind of imitated life. She asks them to wear clothing that cover all parts of their body except their face and make sure they powder their faces whether it's raining or shining. Because of the influence of Mrs. Brofesen, the purported marriage between Mrs. Siba and Mr. Okadu was cancelled and declared to be illegal because it followed the European marriage system instead of the native customary way of marriage. Later in the play, Mrs. Brofesen realizes that her copying of the European values has inflicted so much pain on her life. She then asserts that her life would have been much more better and much more comfortable if she had kept to the African way of life. The members of the Ham Club are another bunch of ignorant imitators. They rejoiced over the white man's whiskey, which has a maddening effect on the people, celebrate the eating of ham, which has a lot of fat, leading to heart diseases, and boast of European weddings, which are clearly at variance with the native customary ones. Let's now consider the Blinkards as a satire. A satire refers to any literary work that is meant to ridicule the evils in a society with the aim of correcting them. Kobnesich's The Blinkard was written as a satire to ridicule the attitude of looking down on our African culture while we treat that of the European as being superior. The playwright makes readers to laugh at the very lives of westernized Gold Coasters. Their blind and unreasonable imitation of European culture is greatly ridiculed by Kobnesichi. First of all, he satirizes their copying of English mannerisms without any consideration of its compatibility or suitability for the African life. In The Blinkard, Mrs. Brofesen refuses to be called darling, but insists on being called Daki by Mr. Brofesen. This happens because, while in England, she realized that Mrs. Gash of Seabourn was called Daki by her husband. She therefore thinks that is the Western and most acceptable way of showing that a man really loves his wife. What is ridiculous here is that Mrs. Brofesen never found out the reason why Mr. Gash called his wife Daki. At the end of the play, she confesses her ignorance. Do you know? I don't mind if my husband does not call me Daki now. I remember that Mrs. Gash was fat and walked like a duck. Another thing that Kobnesichi satirizes in The Blinkard is the overcopying of the Western dress code. Many of the Gold Coasters in the play abandon the African way of dressing to take up the Europeans. Surprisingly, they do so without finding out why the Europeans dress in such a way. For instance, the Cape Coast girls obey Mrs. Brofesen's command that they dress in English fashion by covering every part of their body except their faces, even in the heat of the day. This practice is laughable because, obviously, the English people dress in such a way because of the coolness of the winter. To see people copy this in our temperate weather is simply ridiculous. The sudden change of appetite from local food and drinks to English ones by some Gold Coasters is also ridiculed in the play. When Mrs. Brofesen returns from England, she decides to abandon local foods in favor of ham, chocolate, fruitiers, etc. The men of Gold Coast also abandon the locally made alcoholic drinks in favor of the European gin. At the meeting of the Cosmopolitan Club, the members sing and praise European drinks. Without Europeans, we have only palm wine to drink, which only Bushmen drink. No scholar who wants to be a gentleman must drink palm wine. In August, when it is too cold, there is nothing like whiskey or vermouth to keep you warm. And on Saturdays, before going to the chapel or church, which is more fashionable? Is it good to take a little gin and bitters as an appetizer in order to relish the sermons? According to Mr. Brofesem, the above speech is unreasonable because the European drinks have a maddening effect on those who take it. The way and manner Mr. Sieber handles his fried banana and his cutlery set adds a lot to the playwright's ridicule of the sudden change in appetite for European food. Lastly, Kobnasichi satirizes the peoples despising the abandonment of their local language and their glorification of the English language, which they do not even understand properly. Mr. Brofesen sings about a window tax in fancy. Mrs. Brofesen tells him to stop immediately because it is only bushmen and fishermen and stupids and rascals who sing that song. Also, at the wedding of Mr. Okadu and Miss Siba, when Grandfather Okade decides to advise the couple in fancy, there are cries of "No fancy please, this is European affair" from the members of the Cosmopolitan Club. Meanwhile, those who pride themselves in the English language are not able to make correct constructions in English. For instance, Mrs. Brofesem says, "Did you not hear what your mother-in-law said just now? She said I am bad," instead of, "Did you not hear what your mother-in-law said just now? She said I am bad." Let's now consider the style of the playwright. Style refers to the particular way in which a writer decides to put out his ideas and his work. It includes diction, tone, sentence structure, etc. Style reflects the individual creativity of the writer. Literature allows different kinds of style. In The Blinkards, Kobnasichi has a peculiar style. He uses characterism, suspense, irony, contrast, and specialized diction. First of all, the diction used in The Blinkard could be generally described as simple, except for the flamboyant speeches by the members of the Cosmopolitan Club. He uses simple words, which enhance easy understanding. Kobnasichi has written in both Fancy and English languages. He sometimes makes his characters speak Fancy, and at other times, he allows them to speak only English. But in most cases, whenever the local language is spoken, he offers an English translation on the opposite page. Also, we find that English imitators, such as Mrs. Brofesem, the Cape Coast Girls, and others, speak grammatically incorrect English, while those in support of native culture, such as Mr. Oyimze and Dr. Owenye, speak more refined and grammatically correct English. This is a deliberate attempt by Kobnasichi to ridicule those who imitate the English culture as being inferior as compared to those who follow the native culture. Kobnasichi employs characterism in The Blinkards. Characterism is a dramatic technique which allows a dramatist to draw a link between the behavior and personality of the characters to his or her name. In other words, the names of the characters give readers an idea of who the character is and what he or she is likely to do in the play. In The Blinkards, the meaning of names of characters, such as Mr. and Mrs. Brofesem, Mr. Oyimze, Dr. Owenye, and Mr. Kwasia, has a direct link with what they do in the play. True to the meaning of their names, Mr. and Mrs. Brofesem, which means Mr. and Mrs. Englishness, exhibits so much the English culture of the Gold Coast. In Act 1, Scene 1, Mrs. Brofesem clearly exhibits her copying of the English culture in the extract below. "I don't care about servants. Nobody thinks about servants in England. Mrs. Gash always kisses her husband when he extra nice. I will kiss you." Also, the name Oyimze denotes a person who possesses a high intellectual power or a learned person in a particular field. In the play, we get to know that Mr. Oyinze is a very intelligent student in Gold Coast. This was what offered him the privilege of going to study in England. Again, the winning of the bigamy case clearly shows the intellectual prowess of Mr. Oyimze. It showed that he was a very learned lawyer. He clearly explained and defended the provisions of the Marriage Ordinance of 1884. This is what Mr. Brofesem relates in the extract below. "You are not following. I say that Oyinze proved that the Marriage Ordinance of 1884 was for those already married under the native law. who later conceived the idea of becoming full members of a church. Miss Siba was not engaged to Okadu according to custom. She could not therefore be married to Okadu under the native law. Oyemze showed that, under the native law, an engagement was really a marriage. The only difference being that the bride is not commenced to live with her husband. Kobna uses comedy as a tool to satirize the Blinkards. Comedy is used in the play to ridicule characters and to offer comic relief to the readers and audience. Characters such as Mrs. Brofesem, Half Clown, and Nyameche often say or do things at which readers cannot help but laugh. In Act 4, Scene 1, the dialogue between Mrs. Brofesem and Nyameche showed the bad effect of blind imitation as well as offer comic relief to the readers and audience. Moreover, Kobna makes use of suspense in the play. Suspense refers to the technique by which the dramatist keeps the readers or audience in a mood of expectancy. Suspense makes readers to desire to know what will happen next in the play. At the death of Nnasumpa in Act 2, Scene 3, readers begin to wonder what will become of the marriage between Mr. Okadu and Mrs. Siba. When the bigamy case eventually got to the courts, readers are put in a suspense regarding the outcome of the court's ruling. It must be noted that the use of suspense is what sustains the reader's interest in the play. Lastly, Kobna uses contrast in the play. Contrast is a dramatic technique which allows a playwright to put opposing ideas or characters side by side in a play. A typical example of the use of this technique is in the sharp difference in the ideas of Mr. Oyemze and Mrs. Brofesem. While Mr. Oyemze wears the native dress, eats the native meals, and speaks the native language, Mrs. Brofesem does the opposite. She detests the native clothing and also looks down on people who hold onto the native culture. Again, whilst Mr. Oyemze prescribes that the girls play ampe at a garden party, Mrs. Brofesem recommends that they play tennis and cricket tournaments. Let's now discuss the character of Mr. Oyemze. Mr. Oyemze is a competent lawyer who has had his training in England. He started his schooling in Gokuls, but later had the privilege of pursuing law in England. Mr. Oyemze is one of the most significant characters in the Blinkards. First of all, Mr. Oyemze is a supporter of the native culture. He had great love for the native culture. He did not allow the fact that he had been to England to prevent him from showing his affection for his native culture. He ate the local food, spoke the fancy language, and wore native clothing. As a result of his great love for the native culture, Mr. Oyemze filed to be the defense lawyer for Nana Kataurewa in the bigamy case. He showed that he is a competent lawyer by proving that the marriage between Mr. Okadu and Ms. Siba was unacceptable. He showed that the native marriage procedure was superior to the wedding in church. Mr. Oyemze fought for the triumph of the native culture over the European one in court. Also, Mr. Oyemze convinced Mr. Brofesem of the importance of living by the native culture. In Act 1, we realize that Mr. Brofesem had been forced by Mrs. Brofesem to abandon the native culture. She did not allow him to speak fancy, wear native clothing, eat local dishes, or sing any fancy songs in the house. It appears that Mr. Brofesem had also agreed to this arrangement, even though he was feeling very uncomfortable as he did them. In Act 4, there was a sudden turnaround in the life of Mr. Brofesem. He decided to wear native clothing and sandals outside. He rejects the eating of fatty food, such as ham club, and speak the fancy language when necessary. This sudden turnaround came about as a result of Mr. Oyemze's readiness to practice and defend the native culture. This is what Mr. Brofesem has to say about Mr. Oyemze. No, I don't imitate him. We both view things from the same standpoint. Now, I admit he puts me into the way of reaching that standpoint. Again, Mr. Oyemze reveals the mistakes and weaknesses in the biblical interpretation and analysis of issues by Parson. During the bigamy case, Mr. Parson stood as a witness against Nana Kataurewa. Reverend Parson expected the church to win the case over the Haytons. Unfortunately for him, Mr. Oyemze led the Haytons to triumph over the church in court. This made Reverend Parson misquote and misinterpret the Bible. Ah, lawyer. No, no. I married a couple myself in the house of God. What God had joined together, let no man put asunder. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, said the Lord. You have assisted a hating woman, Nana Katawerewa, to triumph over the church and court. By winning the bigamy case, Reverend Okadu, you have enabled the pagan to triumph over the church in public. At the sound of the triumph, Satan's hosts do flee. It is no use kicking against the pricks. Mr. Oyinze's reaction to Parson shows that he was clearly misquoting and misinterpreting the Bible. He said, I suppose there is no persuading you that you are quoting the text out of its context. You amuse me with your misquoting of the Bible. Please go. Through Mr. Oyemze, Kobna Sechi shows that Africans should not totally reject their traditional religious belief in favor of Christianity. Lastly, Mr. Oyemze educated the girls about their life in England. He told them to forget about some of the things they had been told to do by Mrs. Brofesen because they had been adopted out of context. For instance, Mrs. Brofesen told them that it is indecent if any part of your body is naked, except your face and neck and breast, when you wear an evening dress. So wear gloves and mittens. Besides, we must powder our face. He told the girls that such things are for the vulgar, the lone and the low in the English society. He educated them on the various classes that exist in the English society. He said, you see, in England, then the parvenu apparten, the contented middle class, the socially ambitious middle class. There, I was talking about the English classes. You did not allow me to add that these were also the steady working class, the discontented working classes, and the people of the slums. Let's now move to the characterization of Mrs. Brofesen. One of the major characters used by Kobna Sechi to bring out his major thematic concerns in the Blinkards is Mrs. Brofesen. She is the wife of Mr. Brofesen and was one of the few Gold Coasters who had been to England. In the Blinkards, Mrs. Brofesen is depicted as a blind imitator. She always carried all the European values without considering their effects on her native culture. She neither checked for the reasons behind certain European practices nor studied the proper ways of doing the things she saw in England. In the play, she just asks her husband to address her as Ducky. She puts leaves in a book to dry and cigar ashes on the carpet without finding out the main reasons why they are done in England. All that she says is that they must be done in Gold Coast because they are done in England. Later in the play, Mrs. Brofesen realizes that her copying of the European values has inflicted some pains on her life. She then accepts that life would be much more comfortable if she had kept the African way of life. Also, Mrs. Brofesen had little regard for the native culture. She tried as much as possible to adopt the European ways of dressing rather than the native one. This is because she considered the people who put on native clothing as bushmen. In Act 1, when Mrs. Seba knocks at her door, Mrs. Brofesen said, I think the man who knocked must be in a native dress. If he were in European clothing, he would have pressed the bell. I don't want any people in native dress to come messing up my carpet with their dusty bare feet and spitting upstairs here. She always advises the girls who come around her to put on European clothing instead of the native ones. From the girls, we hear that Mrs. Brofesen says it is indecent if any part of your body is naked except your face and neck and breast when you wear an evening dress. So we have to wear gloves and mittens. Besides, we must powder our face. Not only did Mrs. Brofesen look down upon those who wear native clothing, she also disdained the playing of local games. To her, the young girls should play a strange croquet tournament rather than ampe, which they are familiar with. She also crossed out any such suggestions. At a garden party at Victoria Park, Mrs. Brofesen said to the girls, let's go and see the young people play games. That foolish young man, Mr. Oyemze, says that we must play ampe. The idea, ampe for ladies in European clothing, he must be mad or drunk. Again, Mrs. Brofesen is portrayed as a domineering woman. When she comes back from England, she tends to always insist on having her own ideas implemented. This is certainly foreign to the Gold Coast society, where the man was the head of the family and the ultimate decision maker. She dictates what food should be cooked in the house. She dictates what should be worn and what type of song should be sung in the house. Unfortunately, Mr. Brofestem is so weak that he always vows to let her continue to dominate the house with her bad European values. Lastly, it could be said that Mrs. Brofestem is an extravagant woman. She spends money on things that were not necessary for the family. Nonetheless, she went ahead with them just to show off that she had been to England. She did not consider the family finances before going out on a spending spree at the garden party held at Victoria Park. Unfortunately, Mr. Brofestem had to always bear the cost of her extravagance. One day, Mr. Brofestem burst out with anger concerning the way his wife spends money. You know, I sat up working last night till morning because of that wretched party you will give. I should like to know how we are to keep up all this showy to earn the money you waste. I simply couldn't help yawning. If you start any marriage suffragette tricks with me, you will be sorry. I am becoming fed up. Let's now move to the role of Mrs. Brofestem in the Blinkards. Mrs. Brofestem is a very important character in the Blinkards. She is the wife of Mr. Brofestem and a leader of fashion in Cape Coast. One of the roles played by her in the Blinkards is that she is the leader of fashion. She was considered as the model woman with the ideal dress codes. She advises the girls who came close to her to abandon the native clothing. These Cape Coast girls strictly obey whatever Mrs. Brofestem says with joy because she had been to England. Even when Mr. Oyinze attempts to enlighten them on the right things that must be done, they vehemently disagreed. They said, why she has gone to England, so she can't do anything wrong. We must follow Mrs. Brofestem. She's so nice, we like her ways, we'll follow them. She dressed up so very well and walks with such an air. We must be like her and walk like English ladies do. Also, it was Mrs. Brofestem who taught Mrs. Seba of the European ways. After coming back from England, her dress code and lifestyle were so much attractive to the people of Gold Coast, including Mr. Seba. This therefore made him to send his daughter to Mrs. Brofestem to make his daughter behave like a white lady, to teach her all the things that she has learnt in England. Mrs. Brofestem accepted to train Miss Seba in the European ways. She first made sure that her name was changed, and later changed her diet and began to teach her certain European mannerisms. Unfortunately, the things that Mrs. Brofestem taught Miss Seba landed her in trouble. It led to a pregnancy and the sudden death of her mother, Nasompa. Through Mrs. Brofestem, we get to know that the ancestors lived a better life than those who lived in modern times. In Act 1, Scene 1, Mrs. Brofestem compares the kind of life her ancestors lived to what pertains to the modern society. She realized that modern people enjoy several comfortable things which were absent in the days of her ancestors. In spite of the comfort that modern fancies enjoy, she concluded her comparison. Thus, what I cannot understand is that, in spite of all which makes our lives so enjoyable, our ancestors, whose lives seem so hard to us, lived longer and were happier than we can live or be. She influenced Mr. Brofestem to reject the native culture. In fact, she compelled Mr. Brofestem to put away the native culture and do things just as they are done in England. She made Mr. Brofestem to put away local dishes and start eating English food. She barred Mr. Brofestem from wearing native clothing and sandals, and also from singing fancy songs in the house. But she allowed him to wear pajamas and to smoke cigar and put the ashes on the carpets. Telling the story of his experience with his wife, Mr. Brofestem said, "They are the freest clothing my wife will permit. Just fancy that I, a fancy, should be able to express my thought better in English. Because I evolved from youthhood into manhood in England, then when I want to speak my own language as much as possible, my wife compels me to speak to her always in English, since otherwise it sucks. It is a pressure that comes from Mrs. Brofestem that makes Mr. Brofestem to reject the native culture as projected by Mr. Oyimze." Also, Mrs. Brofesen gives us detail of the life of Mr. Oyimze when he was in England. She describes the way Mr. Oyimze used to dress in England. She said that he used to put on English clothing when he was in school. She gave these details to the girls when they wondered why Mr. Oyimze was so fond of the native clothing. Lastly, Mrs. Brofesen provided comic relief in the play. She is a comic character whose mannerisms are simply laughable. The reader can only laugh at the misconceived European values. Her putting off cigar ashes on the carpet and her putting leaves inside books to dry. Her so-called love for English language is tainted with faulty grammar. For instance, she says to Mr. Brofesen, Mrs. Gash always kissed her husband when he extra knives. At the end of the play, it is amazing to find Mrs. Brofesen of all people professing her love for the native culture. She says, why have I forget to wear native dress? It suits me, isn't it? Oh, what nice long toes I get. They look sweet in sandals. Oh, I am sorry. I will remember, in future, to speak fancy to fancy. Goodbye. Thanks for watching this video. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share this video.